Okay, good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. And thank you for joining us for our webinar on implementation pathways to accelerate EV adoption. My name's Georgia Taylor, and I'm one of the principal consultants at Integrated Transport Planning, or ITP, and I'll be your moderator for the day. We've got some really great speakers lined up for you, so I'll take you through our agenda and a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce them and hand over the floor. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please take a few moments to make sure your microphone is muted and your camera is turned off to help everyone see and hear our speakers more clearly. We'd like to welcome general discussion via the, could we just go back one slide, please? Perfect, thank you. We'd like to welcome general discussion today via the chat function. If you want to share your experiences, resources, or views with others. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please post this in the Q&A function and not in the general chat. And you can see what those two buttons look like on the right side of the slide here to help you with finding those on your own screen. To help us get you the best answer, please specify which of our speakers your question is for. And if you're comfortable doing so, we'd really like you to include your name and organisation in your question too. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible during the Q&A session today. And finally, you should have had a notice when you joined, but just in case, our webinar today is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording after the session. Next slide, please. Our agenda for today. The session will last around 90 minutes, and we've got a really good mix of facilitated discussions, presentations, and Q&A sessions. So after a brief discussion from me, we'll move on to our first speaker facilitated discussion on lessons learned on the challenges and opportunities for implementing EV infrastructure in Europe and Asia, followed by a presentation on accelerating EV adoption through the use of technology platforms such as Volt, and a second facilitated discussion on maximising the value of EV infrastructure investment. We'll finish up with a Q&A today where the speakers will answer your questions before closing the session. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I just want to start by telling you a little bit about Integrated Transport Planning, or ITP, and our interests in EV adoption. Integrated Transport Planning, or ITP, is a world-leading multidisciplinary sustainable transport planning consultancy that's part of the Royal HaskoningDHV family. And our aim is to improve the way the world moves. Next slide, please. We have a global presence spanning multiple continents with over 6,000 professionals working across more than 30 countries and in more than 60 offices. And we have an interest in and considerable footprint in the international development sector, as well as projects closer to my home in the UK. Next slide, please. The diagram on the right side of your screen shows some of the many different disciplines of transport planning that ITP work within. But today our focus is on EVs, and ITP has been supporting our global clients in accelerating electric vehicle adoption for some time now, including supporting electric vehicle roadmap development in the Philippines and Mongolia, e-bus market diagnosis in Kazakhstan, decarbonisation of transport in Central Asia, e-mobility support and investment platform in Asia and the Pacific, and developing technology action maps for EV infrastructure in the UK. Today, we're bringing together a global panel of global experts to discuss the challenges and opportunities for EV adoption across the world. Next slide, please. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce you to some of our speakers for the day. First, we have Moshe Mahmoud, Moshi is a technical director at ITP and has more than 17 years of global experience in the transport sector. He's ITP's global lead for e-mobility value proposition, and he's worked extensively on sustainable transport policy and planning, particularly in the e-mobility sector, in Asia, Middle East, Africa, Europe, and North America. Next, we have Tali Trigg. Tali works for the European Bank of Reconstruction for Reconstruction and Development, and Tali is a principal in the Green Cities division. He's leading on the development of an e-mobility projects in the EBRD countries of operation. And Tali has 15 years of experience working in climate change and sustainable transport and energy across all continents. We have James Leather, the Chief of the Transport Sector Group at Asian Development Bank. He has 30 years of experience in the transport sector, working internationally with development organisations, governments, the private sector, and research institutes. He leads ADB's transport sector operations and oversees the strategic direction of ADB's knowledge, technical and financial support on its developing member countries, private sector clients and partners. We're also joined by Richard de Kam. Richard is a technical director at the province of Gelderland in the Netherlands. As EV charging project leader for the Eastern Netherlands, he's responsible for facilitating and accelerating the rollout of public AC and DC charging infrastructure. Representing over 70 municipalities in the region, he is the chief of the Volt platform, which is one of the important tools in the planning and realisation of charging stations. Tom Fleming is an associate at ITP, and Tom has a background in new mobility policy and strategy development and design. He led the development of transport technology roadmaps for EVs, CAVs, urban transport, rail, water and air, and he's leading the implementation of Volt, an EV localization planning tool. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Moshi, who will be leading our first section with Tali and James on lessons learned from Europe and Asia. Over to you, Moshi.
Thank you, Georgia. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Let me welcome you to this webinar for EV. It's great to see a lot of participants already. Yes, we want to talk about EV. Let's talk about EV. I think we have gone past the debate whether we need EVs or not these days. EV is not certainly the silver bullet that we need to tackle our climate crisis, but definitely, no doubt, it is one of the significant pieces of the puzzle. Now, today, our burning question is not whether we need EV or not. It is about how to implement, how to accelerate EVs in different emerging economies. And if we look at EV, the whole value chain of EV, there's so many things where need to be in place, and both public sector and private sector, both of them got a huge role to play to implement EVs. So let's talk about private sector first. What excites private sector most in this market? It's my pleasure to welcome Tali, just to talk about that. So a few questions for you, Tali. We all know the need for private sector participation is significant, but what are the scopes they have to come into this EV space? What are the business model? What excites private sector? And also, if you can elaborate how EBRD is supporting the private sector engagement in the emerging economies to accelerate EVs. So over to you, Tali.
Thanks so much, Moshi, and thanks everyone for joining today. Happy to share from the EBRD in terms of what we're doing on the private sector and to share some insights from the private sector. There's a lot to cover there, and I can't possibly represent it all, but I will do my best. And if I could show you just a few quick slides to give you some geographical context, I think that should be helpful. So first slide, if that's possible. So just briefly, I'll try to visually, I won't speak much to the slides, but rather just visually show you a few things in terms of what we're doing on electric mobility. Next slide. In short, I mean, the EBRD, so first of all, is, if you're not familiar with it, is a development bank. And our main, let's say, product is finance. So it could be concessional loans, also mixed with technical assistance, but also equity, venture capital. So we're really engaged with the private sector across the board, could be manufacturing down to charge point operators. What you see here in the three different columns, one is on e-mobility services. That's a lot where I think we're talking about today. We're looking at commercial fleets, private fleets, charge point operators. Traditionally, I think EBRD and perhaps others, but we've invested more in network electric, so rail-based transport, metro systems, network rail. But when it comes to battery electric, I think our bread and butter, so to speak, has been public municipal transit. So we've invested increasingly in electric bus fleets. Could be electric trolley bus or fully battery electric. But that's where, let's say, we've been learning when it comes to electric mobility, and we've been expanding since. We did in the last just 24 months, we did our first 2 electric taxi deals. And we also did our first electric logistics deal. And so to say something about the private sector there, and in terms of what we do, I think what's important to say is that for our first electric taxi deal, which was in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, which may not be where one would expect really interesting innovation to come from, but it is. A lot of our markets may not be as well represented, but we're seeing really exciting things happening there. So what we do is we try to provide a lot of, let's say, early mover support for these private sector participants who have a lot of questions about electric mobility. But for whatever reason, maybe it's a fuel price differential, maybe there's a climate commitment, they're interested. So we try to support them. We try to make sure things go well, and then so this can lead to replication and upscaling. And although it wasn't a straight line, I can say that that first deal helped pave the way for our second electric taxi deal, which was in Egypt, both private sector led. It helps pave the way. We're learning as a bank. So the first deal is the hardest, arguably, and then the second deal becomes a bit easier, and so on and so forth. And I think we try to engage with our private sector clients and municipal and public sector to kind of take them along for the ride, share the lessons we can, and improve operations. In the middle column, I'll just say very briefly, we do also policy and strategy support. Some similar work that ITP is doing, we are supporting. So for example, electric mobility strategy in Greece or Kazakhstan, we supported. And then as a bank, we really are looking at the whole value chain. On the right side, you can see we're looking at the energy side of things. We're looking at mining all the way down to battery recycling. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in between there that, let's say, doesn't get talked about so much in traditional context, but we're seeing more of it. I'm thinking of, for example, retrofitting. That's something we're seeing in some of our markets. Charge point operators, which I mentioned, I think there's a lot of appetite and interest there. Hard to say exactly how to proceed, but there's certainly interest and appetite there. Next slide. Here, just a kind of a quick visual representation of the countries we're working in and some of the electric mobility investments. Green dots are network electric, so more classic metro systems and trolley buses. Yellow dots are more what we're talking about here today, battery electric, so fully electric buses, electric taxis or logistics. And also in our case, since we're looking at a lot of legacy systems with overhead lines, we also invest in electric trolley buses, by which I mean in-motion charging. So trolley buses which have an additional small battery, which can allow for autonomous range of, for example, up to 20 kilometers. It's not often talked about in electric mobility context, but I bring it up because what we're seeing is that when cities do this, they start to build some capacity and interest in electric mobility writ large, and this leads to other investments in the e-mobility ecosystem. So I think it certainly helps pave the way for other types of vehicle modes and use cases. Next slide. So as I said, our let's say bread and butter in electric mobility investments has been buses, and we could have a whole day. I think there's a week coming up actually in Brussels on zero emission buses. So, but I will just do one slide and to say that there's a lot there. We take a multi-pronged approach. We know there's support needed from authorities. We invest. We support capacity building. We at the bottom there, you can see through our flagship program in EBRD called Green Cities, we work with municipal authorities to support be it performance service contracts, capacity building, but also these kind of let's say frameworks, which is what our Green Cities program is. It's a good opportunity to engage a city because you bring in stakeholders from across the board, and we really do think that that's what's needed for a cross-cutting topic like electric mobility. So to give you a very concrete example, when you're investing in electric buses, one of the biggest issues is the grid connection and to the depot and whether or not that is even technically viable, what the lead time is, how much does it cost, things like this. And if you have the utility and the energy sector involved from the beginning, it just makes things so much easier and more predictable. And that's what I think everyone's looking for. At the bottom there, I wanted to share, we published a paper 2 years ago looking at zero emission buses, and that's available in English, Russian, and even Spanish. We collaborated with the UITP and GIZ, and I think that's looking at choosing electric, and now we're starting to move towards using electric to understand what the best practices are in terms of implementation and operations. So we'll be happy to share that eventually as well. Next slide. So just to wrap up from my side, so when it comes to, let's say, key success factors and the way forward, I think I mentioned bringing in the energy sector at the outset is one, so integration. Another one is frameworks. We think there's a lot of potential with sustainable urban mobility plans or green city action plans to foster this cross-sectoral dialogue, which we think is quite needed to electric mobility. As Moshe was saying, we're not here to talk about replacing, one drivetrain with another. Electric vehicles are part of the solution, and so we want to think about the full ecosystem, where it fits in, how it fits in. Some of the emerging trends below, I think you've all seen a lot of, let's say, graphs, sometimes too optimistic perhaps, but just battery costs are coming down, efficiency is coming up. And this is good, but often the key is the how implementation. And I think that's where we're trying to focus a lot of our support. Private sector are often asking, how do we do this? Not necessarily which technology. That almost oddly seems easier. Government support for EV infrastructure, I would argue, is an essential step that can be taken today. It was a question that Moshe had about private sector, and I think to answer it, what is the role of the private sector versus public sector and so on, and this chicken and egg thing of EVs and charging infrastructure. I've always thought that's a bit of a, let's say, a false sort of an analogy or metaphor because both are needed. But what research has shown in the past decade is when can the private sector really take off, and what does the government need to do to enable things initially? And there's no, let's say, one number here. We do see, for example, that around 5% of market penetration of EVs, then you really start to see private sector, let's say, feel fully enabled, charge point operators play a big role and so on. So I think both obviously have to play a role, but the government on a national and city level can do a lot in the beginning to pave the way from a regulatory point of view, or even just to kind of provide some assurance to fleets and others that there will be charging stations. Next point, I was just saying about ecosystems, that looking at it as an ecosystem is the most helpful way. And then the final point is to incorporate smart city elements. Smart city is quite a vague term, can almost mean nothing. It's too much of an abstraction sometimes. But what we mean here is that we're talking about how digitalization really can enable some things. So for example, parking, which is quite a boring subject normally, but in this context, if we're talking about parking and adding smart and digital features to parking and payment systems, if you bundle that with charge points, you start to see things that really take off. And we've seen this in some markets where cities went from not being able to collect any parking revenue, having no charge points at all, and then 5 years later, they're making money and providing EV as a service or charging as a service. So I think there's a lot of potential there to incorporate these so-called smart city elements. So next and final slide. So yeah, again, I'll stop from my side, but just to say, I hope that provides a bit of an overview, both visually where we're working, and to say that there's a lot of appetite from the private sector. There's a lot of excitement across the board, not just in charging infrastructure, but more niche things, even like electric maritime or retrofitting. But fleets is also another big one we've been working on increasingly. So happy to tell you more during discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tali. I really like the term that you mentioned, choosing electric. We are moving from choosing electric to using electric. So this is what's happening, how to accelerate, how to kind of get the EV rolled out rather than kind of still debating about whether we need EV or not. Another thing that I really picked up, that public sector, they have a really big responsibility to create that environment, a conducive environment where private sector and other players can come in. And this is where I'm going to go to James Leather. It's my pleasure to bring James Leather here to talk about the public sector engagement and also what are the implementational challenges of EV in the emerging economies that you see. We did receive a nice question about policy from our audience. What balance is needed between national and the local policy in this sector? How they can be cascaded down from the national level to local level? And I want to add another question to James, that similar to Tali, that what are the priorities that ADB have in supporting EV acceleration in the emerging economies? So over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Let me try and package the first part on the implementation challenges. Let me try and package those in the positive. What's the positive aspects and what may be the harder aspects as well. In the positive, I want to start off by saying that the vehicle types, the distance travel, the types of trip are quite different in many developing parts of Asia than they may be in the more developed North America or European examples. And just to put that in perspective, our estimate is around 95% or higher of worldwide road-based e-vehicles are in the Asian region. This is because of the huge dominance of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, which is orders of magnitude larger than the four-wheelers. So on the positive side, what can be brought in to implement e-vehicles? The smaller vehicles means that the cost is lower because the battery requirements for those to propel those smaller vehicles is much less. So the sort of tipping point, the business case for two three-wheelers compared to four-wheelers or heavier vehicles has already been reached. Also, a lot of the production in the area, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, but a number of four-wheelers, particularly coming out of the People's Republic of China. So the vehicles are produced within this region. The final positive, trip distances are usually a lot shorter than they may be in Europe or North America. So that range anxiety is less of an issue. If you're traveling in urban areas, you're likely to find a charger or be able to get home if it's a private use or back to your depot. But on the flip side, long distance buses or trucks, if that power supply is not uniform across the network or the charging infrastructure is not there, then clearly that's not just that's a barrier rather than an anxiety to those. The final thing perhaps on the positive side is that there has been quite a long history, and I said a lot of the production is in this part of the world, and perhaps they're less tied to their combustion engines as individual choices. I noticed your slide, ITP has done an awful lot of work across almost everywhere in the Asian region, which is great to see. Nepal, I saw, was one gap in your map, maybe Nepal and Bhutan, but Kathmandu Valley at one point had the largest number of e-vehicles anywhere in the world with their SAFA tempos. That was about 20 odd years ago, before e-vehicles were really a thing. So there has been quite a long history. And I think we're all aware that some public transport operators in China are doing 100% electric bus fleets. It's not sort of a trial of a set number within the broader thing. It's on the whole side. So there are a number of positives on implementation in these developing economies. Perhaps the harder areas, policy. there is a clear lack in that policy. And as we heard from Tali, the policy allows the decision making to be more certain in those. So that's a significant gap in many, but not all. People, Republic of China, India, Vietnam, Thailand, some others of the developing economies have or are starting to set quite clear guidelines with relations to decarbonization generally, but e-vehicles in particular. The charging infrastructure I meant, and also being able to access the range of vehicles in all our markets is a problem. And the final point on the harder part, the age of the vehicles, so the in-use vehicles. Some of the trucks are 30, 40 years old that we see on the roads around Southeast Asia. We can set policies for new vehicles, but how will we deal with the second-hand vehicles? And we've been working with UNEP on potentially second-hand vehicles flooding the developing economies from the developed economies when they set more stringent policies and retire those vehicles early. Then do we have similar strict policies to avoid those vehicles being dumped? I don't like to use the term dumped, but if they're on-sold as new vehicles into the developing world and start a life for another 30 years as a highly polluting ICE vehicle, there is that point. In terms of the national local, I think India is setting a good example here. The central government has set quite clear objectives and how those objectives will cascade down through the states and at the city level. But given what I said earlier, that the policies are to a large extent in their infancy with regards to e-vehicles, the national local debate, very strong policy in People's Republic of China, good policy at the national trickling down to the local level in India, but the vast majority still need a lot of support to develop the climate change components in transport policies and vice versa, putting transport into their climate documents, their NDCs and LTSs. Very quickly on our role and our priorities. From what I've said, policy, we want to set a decarbonisation pathway for all modes of transport, but focusing on what's the lower hanging fruits, which is two-wheelers, three-wheelers, urban taxis, urban buses. Monitor what's happening on other road transport, let's say fruit slightly higher up the trees, the trucks, the long-distance buses, but also keeping an eye on second-hand vehicles across those modes, as well as aviation and maritime, so we can look at a full decarbonisation policy strategy and look at all the tools in the toolkit. I would say we've done about 21 financial assistance now for e-vehicles. The majority have been in our private sector arm, and where they've been done on sovereign support, again, as we heard from Tali, it's primarily been in public transport, and here I'm talking road-based. I'm not including in those 21 projects rail-based electrification, but bus systems more on the sovereign side, because we're looking at public transport reform, franchising mechanisms with e-vehicles. But our private sector colleagues have been doing a lot more in terms of vehicles and more innovative, say, e-ferries in Bangkok as another form of transport. I hope that answered. I think you put 3 questions. Hopefully that's provided the response to the 3 of them. But I see the very positive uptake in the region, but the policy is required, and we do have some concerns of how do we get this in-use vehicles out, considering there is a tendency to hang on to the vehicles a lot longer than there may be in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Many thanks, James. It's really informative. And we are getting some questions in the Q&A box. Please write your question in the Q&A box. At the end of this session, we'll have a Q&A session. So we'll try our best to go through all of the questions if possible. So I'm going to hand it over to Georgia now for the next session. So over to you, Georgia.
Yeah, thank you again, James and Tali. They were very interesting presentations. It's great to hear about your experience, and investment in charging infrastructure is undoubtedly a critical building block in the rollout of electric vehicles. And of course, there's some tools out there that can help us make informed decisions on where we roll out charging infrastructure. So on that note, let me invite Tom Fleming from ITP to talk about a tool called Volt. Next slide, please, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Georgia. So welcome everybody. I'm Tom Fleming, Associate at ITP. I'm going to be talking to you today about optimizing the layout of EV charging infrastructure and the role that Volt, which is a tool developed by ITP's parent company, Royal HaskoningDHV, can play in that question. Very, very quickly, very simply, 10 minutes from me, cover 3 items: why plan for EV charging, what is Volt, and how can it help? So next slide, please. So why plan for EV charging? It sounds like a pretty simple and obvious question. It probably is, but the development of EV charging networks is often less planned than you may intuitively think. Often EV charging networks, they emerge organically in response to known demand, and therefore tend to be biased a little bit towards EV purchasing behavior. The planning question is all about maximizing customer utility while minimizing the number and cost of EV charging assets. So it's a bit of a trade-off. It's about providing the right type of charger in the right location at the right cost. And you can only really optimize if you take that strategic vision-led approach. So a few important considerations for EV charging planning are listed on this slide. Next slide, please. So typically, the development of EV charging networks begins as a reactive process. That could be reactive to user requests, or it could be in terms of home charging. It could be users sort of buying and installing chargers themselves, but it's quite ad hoc. The benefit of a reactive process, of course, is that the demand for the charger is practically guaranteed. If someone's investing their own money in it, they're probably going to use it. But the downsides are that it can kind of bake in a bit of inequality that we tend to associate with EVs and car ownership, and it's also very or it can be very slow. So in order to respond adequately to the scale of EV charging infrastructure needed, cities in particular need to take the initiative and turn to a vision-led strategic planning approach. We can call this proactive design. Proactive design would be crucial to enabling us to scale up EV charging infrastructure and deliver net zero. And proactive design tends to flow from having an EV charging strategy, which is really the other important thing to note. Next slide, please. So to support
Volt,
our clients with the transition.
Volt.
Sorry, I was going to say, to support clients with the transition from reactive to proactive design, we have developed Volt, and this video is a bit of an introduction to Volt. Please press play.
Volt, paving the way for electric vehicles. The number of electric car sales is rising globally, which brings a growing need for a carefully planned network of publicly accessible charging infrastructure. Finding the right location for charging infrastructure in an environment that competes for space is a big challenge in our cities. Our growing need for mobility makes this competition even stiffer. City authorities are facing challenges keeping up with the demand for public charging infrastructure, especially now the uptake of electric vehicles is gathering pace. Area-wide network-based planning of EV chargers provides a more cost-effective and sustainable solution than responding to individual requests for ad hoc public chargers. How can we support the rapid influx of electric vehicles, ensuring safe, secure, and sufficient access to charging facilities, while gaining the right value for investments and resources for city authorities? We present our solution, Volt. This data-driven platform helps to plan and manage the public charging network in our cities, enabling a faster, more efficient rollout of a coherent, robust network that meets the current and future demand. How can Volt contribute? It provides a clear and concise overview of the current and projected future demand for charging stations across a city. It helps to find the most optimal set of locations for charging stations by a data-driven algorithm which can be tuned to local preferences and knowledge. It helps city authorities to test various charging scenarios, to test new opportunities and alternatives. It helps to shift away from an ad hoc and reactive approach to a more proactive, coordinated approach to EV chargers planning. Electric vehicles can bring benefits such as increased sustainability, improved livability, and significantly reduced pollution levels, ensuring cleaner, greener air in our cities. With Volt, local and regional authorities are able to fast-track the transition to more sustainable mobility. Get in touch and request a demo.
Superb. So next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so this slide just tries to recap some of what was set out in that video. It's important to note that Volt is an EV charging planning and management tool. It's also a location intelligence tool, and it's best suited to the planning and management of area-wide destination charging networks, and particularly at scale. So it does adopt an algorithmic approach, which I think is useful because it's therefore very objective, and it's taking data and sort of known factors to build that network. I guess sort of the first development of Volt, we really built it from highway assets and electrical assets. So thinking in terms of physical infrastructure. Increasingly, we're trying to take it into the domain of socio-demographic data and policies as well. So I don't know, just very simplistically, if you wanted to say, well, I want 2 charge points on every street in my city, you could program Volt to do that, and then it would tell you where the best 2 places in every street were to give you that network. So highly customizable, and it would get deployable in lots of contexts as well. So yeah, that's a quick recap there. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a look at the Volt interface in its simplest form. Here we have the city of Arnhem in the Netherlands. Arnhem's a city of around 160,000 people, and this map is showing the charging network, both existing and planned in Arnhem. The blue points represent the existing network, and then the points of other colors are the future network. So within this, green dots highlight sites that have been identified by Volt and have been approved. The yellow ones are currently awaiting review, and the red ones are points that have been rejected. So it's important to note that sort of Volt is a tool. It's using an algorithm. It's not possible to get sort of there'll be factors beyond the data that's coded into Volt that we know that will just mean that certain sites won't come forward for one reason or another. Some of which won't be technical, some of which might be political or stakeholder driven. But it's this shows kind of really good sort of acceptance of also really good validation, I guess, of the algorithm that Volt uses. Next slide, please. So just building on that, around 70% of charge point locations initially identified by Volt in the Netherlands were successfully implemented. So this again, this plays to that balance of red to green, sort of accepted to rejected sites. We think this is pretty good. And the key benefit of Volt, of course, is that you're doing this at scale. So if you were planning reactively and somebody raises a request for an EV charging EV charge points, it's not necessarily that they're going to be, although they want one, the site might not be feasible. So what Volt does is it gives you high quality of output and delivers at pace and at scale as well. Next slide, please. So just to highlight the real kind of usefulness of Volt and the value of Volt in the Netherlands, the market it was initially developed for. So currently we know that 50% of municipalities in the Netherlands use Volt. We believe we can grow that to 80% by the end of next year. Netherlands is a country of 125,000 EV charge points, when 17 million people. So that compares to the UK where I am, where we've got 50,000 charge points and 67 million people. So that's quite a gulf there, and you can really see and sort of begin to understand the value that Volt has as a tool in supporting that acceleration of EV charging and uptake of EVs more broadly. Next slide, please. Okay, and just finally, this slide outlines the kind of five stages to Volt adoption. So if you're a government entity or you're representing a government entity, this slide sort of explains how we would work with you to deploy Volt. We're not here to hard sell anyone Volt. If it's going to work, or if it's not going to work for you, we'll tell you. But if your question is destination charging at scale over an area, there's a good chance that it might be useful. And yeah, the key market for Volt really is that destination charging planning piece. So yeah, thank you. Next slide, please. Fantastic. Yeah, and if anyone wants to know more, please get in touch. My details are on the slide. I'll hand back to you, Georgia.
Okay, thanks, Tom. It's been really interesting to hear how Volt can support the rollout of charging infrastructure. And it's great to hear about the positive impact it's been having in the Netherlands as well. So do get in touch with Tom if you'd like to learn anything more about Volt. And over to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Moshi and Richard to take us through the next session on maximising the value of EV infrastructure investment. Over to you, Moshi.
Thank you, Georgia. So yeah, from Tom's presentation, as you can see, area-wide charging planning is quite important. But the thing is here, how do we get the best value of our investment in rolling out EV chargers? Definitely a knowledge-based platform or tool such as Volt can help decision maker to make the well-informed decision. Now, my pleasure to invite Richard de Camp from Gelderland, who is a user of Volt as well, but mainly to talk about the issues around charging infrastructure planning. So, Richard, how can a well-informed charging infrastructure planning process maximize the value for money of investment from your experience? And also, what do you think in terms of what are the key influencing factors in determining public charger locations? So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Moshi. Thanks for the invitation. Welcome, everybody. Short introduction maybe first. My name is Richard de Camp. I work for the province of Gelderland in the Netherlands, and representing, in fact, 77 municipalities in the two provinces that work together on this area. And we help them out in rolling out public regular chargers and fast chargers and charging infrastructure. And we've indeed chosen to use a platform like Volt. We've, in fact, using Volt itself, we're Volt users to plan infrastructure, do that in a proactive way, as Tom explained. Even more proactive because we are already realizing infrastructure without concrete demand, so doing that based on forecast. But we also use the tool to have at least all the locations planned already. So as soon as demand comes in, an inhabitant wants a public charger requests for it, we know where to put it. And that is a bit of an answer to your question, Moshi. So the importance of planning the infrastructure is that we want to make sure that as soon as we start realizing charging locations, we don't want to run into issues that we could have foreseen. So we combine on the one side the forecast of EVs and therefore the required charges with the technical restrictions in the municipalities. So and that's the power of a tool like Volt. So we look at the position of the low voltage network. We look at the availability of parking spots. We make sure that the ground we're putting on, we're realizing on, is public ground. Otherwise, you're not allowed to. And the combination of those two results in a planning of infrastructure for the coming years. As an answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, how do you determine, and what are the key factors that helps you to determine it's a fast charger, slow charger, destination-based charger, and the area that you select? Is there any kind of specific influencing factor that you look at?
Well, we make a distinction between, of course, between the regular charges and the fast charges, and the locations on which you place the regular and the fast are slightly different. For the regular charges, we follow the what I've just explained, and we really look at forecast, which is rather reliable. We have the technical restrictions in the streets. And that results in possible positions. For the fast charges within the municipalities, we really look at those positions where a lot of people come and normally stay only a limited amount of time, let's say 20 minutes to half an hour. Mm-hmm. Those are the within that's within the boundaries of within a municipality. Those are the locations that we look at. Of course, that's different to the ones near the motorways and the other main roads.
Yeah. Okay. Now, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time. So I think we are now we can move on to the last session, which is basically Q&A. We are getting a lot of questions on our Q&A box. Plus, as part of the registration process of this event, people send a lot of really interesting questions for our panel members. So we can start with our Q&A session. And please do send any other follow-on question to our Q&A box, so we'll try to address them. So to start with, I want to start with a very interesting question around policy. There's a question came in saying, for a city looking to meet 2030 net zero targets, what are the 3 critical success factors behind rolling out a successful EV scheme? I want to get Jamie's thought on this question.
Sorry, 2030 would, certainly in developing cities, that's quite an ambitious target. So again, it comes back down to the policy, but as a net zero by 2030, again, looking at the age of these vehicles, it's all very well setting that 2030 for new vehicle purchase, but the retirement of those vehicles for a full transport system net zero by 2030, we are looking something more 2050 and beyond, to be honest, which may not fit well with those that are calling for a net zero 2050, but just the realities are that 20, 30-year-old vehicles are on many of the developing economies' streets, and to try and put in buyback schemes for those is going to be a significant challenge as well. So sorry, not answering the 2030 question, but clearly what is required 2030, 40, 50, whenever that net zero target may be set, it's the policy. That starts the debate, and then it triggers down to the better informed decisions that can be taken once clearer policies are set. And if I may take the opportunity, sorry, monopolizing it, but I noticed that the point on price parity, because I think that's also linked. The purchase price and the operating price if those two things are combined, and it comes back to sort of this perfect knowledge, the lighter vehicles or the heavier vehicles that travel more, taxis and buses in urban context, the operating costs will offset the higher capital purchase price for those, the lighter two-wheelers, three-wheelers that dominate most of the private vehicle fleets in Southeast Asia. That price parity, or the tipping point between combustion engines and e-vehicles, has already been reached if you look at more of the life cycle cost. But pure knowledge and assessment of those and personal preferences may not follow that pure economic or financial assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and this 2030 debate about 2030, 2040, or 2050 is got a lot to do with the readiness of that country. I mean, how ready they are to kind of roll out. Because the thing that you mentioned, the supply chain, a certain country is quite heavily dependent on another country's supply chain. Therefore, whether they use ICE or they will end up having secondhand EVs, will depend on the supply chain. So it is difficult to get a kind of correct answer whether it's 2030 or 2040, but this is more like ambitious target, that where I want to be, where that country wants to be during that period. Thank you so much, James. Then I'm moving on to the next question. Is the electrification of commercial passenger and freight fleets a faster and more certain strategy for the decarbonization of the road transport sector compared to personal and private vehicles? I want to get Tali's view on this. It's basically freight and passenger mass transit against personal private vehicles. So Tali, what's your view? Which will be a lot faster to achieve?
Sure. Well, I think to bounce off something Jamie was saying, that we shouldn't view the sector, let's say, monolithically. It's not just going to be a switch. And I think it's a good question, and I think there's a lot to be said for this kind of usage pyramid. That which is used most gets usually shorter payback periods. The OPEX will outweigh the higher CapEx, hopefully. So I think there's a lot of potential for fleets, and that's why arguably we as a bank have seen our first opportunities in fleets. It might be leasing makes more sense. It's a little less risky for them. They have better overview. When you own 100 vehicles, you can kind of do more research, more capacity development. You understand more what you're getting into. So I think fleets, yeah, certainly make a lot of sense. And it's a very good place to start, and that's arguably why we've started in this area.
Thank you. And then a question to Tom. One missing element in almost all discussion related to charge anxiety and uncertainty. There are different ways to mitigate that, but there's one specific question about app-based application. Can an app-based application help to reduce that range or charge anxiety?
Yeah, good question. It can, and it can certainly help. I think we really want to think in terms of sort of seamless experience with EVs. So there are various pain points if you're a user to using an EV or maybe to adopting an EV, and some of that is around charge points availability, knowing where charge points are, knowing that they're going to work, and the booking piece potentially as well. So if you've got an app that's able to draw all that together, then that certainly helps. But also an app can't do everything. So fundamentally the infrastructure needs to be there. It needs to work. We used to talk a lot about range anxiety, and range anxiety I think is still very, very relevant in many parts of the world. But increasingly, certainly in Europe, we're kind of moving away from range anxiety towards charge anxiety. So quite often, some people that they have the batteries in their EVs are such capability that they're charging at home is sufficient, and they rarely have to charge elsewhere. but that's not the case for everybody, and then charging anxiety becomes a much more important piece of the jigsaw. But I think if we think of the end state, I like to think back to maybe where we were with GPS and satellite navigation technology maybe 20 years ago, where you had a sat nav system that told you how to get from A to B, then it told you how to it told you live traffic conditions and what have you as well, and eventually I see EV charging going in the same direction, where actually it's just your connected car or vehicle sort of starts to do all of the thinking for you, and then we're kind of going beyond apps even. So your route is telling you not only how you're getting from A to B in the quickest or shortest time, it's also planning your charging for you, and maybe all you have to do is confirm the recommendations that it's putting forward. But it's all part of a pathway, I think, that we're on. So yeah, apps important part of the rule, important part of the jigsaw, but not the end, not the only solution.
Thank you, Tom. The next question is, what challenges do you face collecting data to measure the before and after impacts of your funding? And can we ask James to come in on that one, please?
Sure. Depends what we have a number of priorities internally of our performance indicators. One of them is how much finance we're providing. So that's a monetary number related to our investments. We also try to keep a tab on the CO2 impacts with and without our assistance, which is harder to measure with certainty. Particularly, it's okay if you're talking fleet vehicles and you're able to sort of monitor that if the buses return to the depot. But when you're looking at investments more in the private sector beyond the fleets, it's harder to measure the CO2 impacts. We can measure how much finance we have in there. The other area where we tend to struggle on data is just the sheer number of vehicles and distance traveled and the type of diesel or gasoline engines that we're dealing with, because vehicle registration, annual registrations, upkeep, odometer readings is not as kept as well as it should be. So one thing we are putting in those decarbonisation pathways is to enhance annual data collection, vehicle inspection and recording of what is happening at the city level or the regional level, the national level, and trying to make sure that that database is initiated, kept up, and that would allow us to better measure the performance, whether that's operation CO2 reductions or financial support as well. Thank you.
Thank you, James. The next question is, many new innovative services are SMEs and startup led. What help is there to pitch to international development banks to support those SMEs and startups? And that's a question for both Tali and James, please.
James, do you want to go ahead? I'll kick it off. So that's a very good question, and I think it's a very exciting area. As I mentioned, EBRD does, for example, VC financing and equity, which was surprising to me before I joined the bank, to be honest. And I think it's really useful for some of these areas and players like charging infrastructure. That's something where it's quite hard because, again, there's no loan to take, there's no assets yet, there's only projected users in the future. That gets quite tricky, and that's a very good place for banks, the development banks, to play a role to help the charging infrastructure ecosystem kick off. A few others like retrofitting, then you're talking about quite new technologies in a sense. That's another area. Charging as a service also, where you're integrating transport and energy. I think a lot of it comes down to that if commercial banks, don't have familiarity with it, they shy away, and development banks by design shouldn't. Do we always jump headfirst in? Maybe not, but this is an area where we need to get more involved. Thank you.
Just to add to that, on the SME side, fully agree. If we're looking at fleet vehicles, it's fine. If we have supported vehicle manufacturing, and when we're looking at two-wheelers and particularly more on the three-wheelers, that is a sort of paratransit, so it is a public transport mode or a delivery mode. We have also insisted that there is local production facilities established as well, because it's not buying a typical family vehicle from the large automobile manufacturers when you're looking at the two three-wheelers, or the converting a two-wheeler to a three-wheeler. So we have been supporting directly some international e-vehicle manufacturers in the region that are selling worldwide, but we've also, where we are looking at those more localized vehicles, particularly the three-wheelers, we've been looking at local production and enhancement as well, support of SMEs. Thank you.
Thanks both. The next question is, to what extent will current charging infrastructure that is being deployed at the moment become obsolete or capable of upgrade as battery and vehicle technology continue to develop rapidly? And that question's come in for Tom. I'm sure Tom will be able to give us some insight from the UK. If any of the other panelists want to come in with any international experience there, we'd also welcome that. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. Another really good question. Yeah, obsolescence. I guess obsolescence is always a risk to some extent or another. But I feel increasingly confident, but more confident than before, that actually I think what we need is a mix of charging technologies. And so when we think of some of the maybe charging technologies that came forwards earlier, particularly thinking in terms of upstanding charge point infrastructure, actually a lot of that's really good and has lots of benefits, and that's partly why it came forward so quickly. And then some of the newer technologies are really trying to solve problems that type of charging infrastructure couldn't already address. So in the UK, we've had issues with sort of terraced streets without sort of off-plot parking, and there's some really innovative charging methods coming forward there. And I think what we need is a mix, and ultimately I think it's the bigger risk is that not having enough charging infrastructure is going to be the constraint on demand, rather than worrying too much about, you know, whether one piece is no longer going to be used or another. I think if we can develop that network as quickly as possible, scale that up as quickly as possible, and we may well run into other constraints, such as those related to the energy network. But I think there's also an asset life cycle question, a kind of product life cycle question. So if you've got an EV charging infrastructure and maybe it's got a product life of 10 years, let's say, at that point you've got an opportunity then to upgrade it anyway, and as long as sort of procurement and what have you is set up in the right way, that provides you with that. I know there was some discussion in the chat about sort of whether vehicle batteries are just going to become so good that you realistically aren't going to need to charge at places other than home, for example. But I think with that one, it's important to recognize that some of the higher performance vehicles, the batteries are also very expensive, and so you're always going to have a range of kind of battery qualities, a range of different ranges, and therefore a range of different types of charging infrastructure that's going to be needed to service the different types of electric vehicles that are on the road as well. So lots of angles, but I feel that obsolescence is probably less of a risk for me in my mind than it maybe was before.
Thank you, Tom. That was really good. I'll pick up the next question, and this is quite interesting. It'll be interesting to hear from Richard, to see a public sector perspective. The question is, petrol filling stations have always been run by private companies. That's true. Why is it seems that EV charging has to be run by national or local government? Because I think there is a notion that public chargers, local authorities, so it be in the UK or elsewhere, local authorities or national government are quite responsible for rolling out EV chargers. So do you agree with that, Richard?
Yeah. In Holland, I must say I don't agree with this, because, for example, the The regular charges, already 50% of them, 50% of the publicly available regular charges is put on private ground. So that's one side of it. On the other side, the charges that are realized on public grounds are hardly ever paid for by local government or regional government. The construction that we have in Holland is that the ground is made available to charge point operators. They do the investment, they pay for the maintenance, they take the risk, and yes, they also earn the money. So I also saw a question coming by on funding. So in Holland, at least, the situation is that local authorities hardly ever, unless they explicitly take this role and they want to be in charge there, but hardly ever there's money going from the local governments to pay for the realization of the charge infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. The next question, I'm going to bring Tali in here. This fuel or fossil fuel car purchase ban that we talked about 2030 or any other countries for another year. What do you think should be the main priority before fossil fuel car purchase ban? So Tali, over to you.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think it's not, either or kind of thing, and I think it shows a lot the importance of policy signals. It was mentioned before that not only is there Moshe, you said it, not only is there the demand side, but there's the supply side. So, we talk to a lot of our clients and countries who say, well, we're not ready for electric mobility. That'll be later on. And we try to always kind of send the message that, electric mobility is a marathon, not a sprint. And it's coming, and getting ready is never a bad idea, because not only is there the demand side to consider, but as you just said, the supply side. So I'm sure we've all seen these quite interesting maps of list of countries and regions which are phasing out fossil fuel vehicles. But if you look at the OEM side, it's also quite something. They're also phasing out fossil fuel vehicles. So there's also the supply side to consider, what it means in terms of getting things ready for secondhand markets. So in our countries, some of our countries have, for example, 95% of vehicles sold are, secondhand imports. What does that look like when you go electric? And we have one country which is quite interesting, which is Jordan, which has quite a high number of imported secondhand Nissan Leafs. So we've been following kind of developments there closely as a case study to understand what's going well, what to keep in mind. And the government there was initially had an exemption for it to kind of kickstart the market, and then there was huge uptake. So I think we're trying to pay attention to these early lessons there. To answer the question a little more straightforward, I mean, yes, that's a very good idea, or that's a high level way to do it, and that's happening. What should be done before? I think a lot can be done on charging infrastructure. I was reading some research for China, which has arguably the most experience so far with deployment. And what they found was that between 2010 and 2020, I believe it was, deploying charging infrastructure per dollar was 4 times more efficient than consumer subsidies. And I bring that up because I do think this, when we talk about optimization of charging infrastructure deployment and siting and so far, it's an endless discussion, but I do think there's something to be said for, let's say, a bit of a safety blanket. In other words, to let consumers understand and fleet owners and so on that this is where things are heading. And I'm not saying we should just deploy and hope for the best, not at all. That's the opposite of today's discussion, but rather just to say that it's a very good, I think, investment to look at charging infrastructure, because it seems like intuitively somehow direct consumer subsidy would be better. And a lot of European countries have already phased these out. But in some of our countries, they're looking at, okay, well, what's the first step we can take? Where can we support things? And we often say that a lot of times it's regulatory. Deploying a charging infrastructure may not even be legal. So you need to make it simply legal, pave the way, and that sort of thing. So for me, a lot of the focus should be on charging infrastructure, which, as we heard today, takes a variety of forms. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. The next question we received that, do you think the rollout of EV will be fast enough to make the impact necessary, the impact that we are expecting? We are talking about the climate change, there is a target to reduce global warming. Given the current appetite to change different cultures and funding models, so I want to bring in James here to respond this. Different funding models available to roll out EVs, how to accelerate the adoption. So do you think, in your opinion, will we get the impact that we are expecting from these initiatives?
Simple answer, yes. We have seen a significant change. Okay, the numbers are small, but as we've seen, they can grow and are growing incredibly rapidly. With that policy, and I think the two things that have come out of this discussion, clear policy, the charging infrastructure to allow that to happen, will accelerate that change. Yes, there is a number of issues. I keep mentioning the in-use vehicles and how those are retired out. But I think that the decision point, the hard economics of this, private individuals or SMEs, they will make better informed decisions. And as battery prices come down, for the smaller type vehicles or the high use, comparative costs, operation and CapEx, OpEx, that decision will become somewhat of a no-brainer. It will happen. In terms of the time frame, I was sort of edging towards the 2050 as opposed to the 2030 in many of our developing economies. That's an issue. The other issue I would stress is that the lighter vehicles perhaps emit less than the heavier vehicles, and the technologies, and I noticed there's a couple of questions been put on higher up that tree, the longer distance buses or trucks. Is EV the right path? Those, particularly on the freight side, they are the ones that are emitting more CO2 than private vehicles within urban areas as a whole. The reason they're higher up the tree, because those technologies are not yet really there. Is electric trucks the way forward, or are there other forms of zero emission powertrains that could be used in longer distance trucks? The reason they're higher up the tree, either the vehicles are just too expensive, or it may not be the most suitable technology. So there are some big holes, particularly in the big emitting types of road-based transport, that need to be addressed, and really accelerating the technology. I'm always a bit of an optimist, just looking at the way that the private vehicles, smaller two-wheelers, three-wheeler, four vehicles, the battery prices have come down with those investments. I think the acceleration for all forms of road-based transport will also accelerate significantly in the next 10, 15 years. So the decision point for new purchase will happen, has happened, and will increasingly happen. How we phase out the in-use vehicles to reach that net zero, that's going to be a challenge as well. Thank you.
Thank you, James. The next question is, do many local authorities in the UK apply for grants from the bank, or is it mainly for the private sector? How do UK local authorities get involved? And that's a question for Tom, please.
Thanks,
I think
George.
Tom, if you can elaborate. Plus, I also want to bring Tali to respond. Tom, go ahead. And after that, Tali, if you can also respond to this question.
Okay, yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, I mean, so UK local authorities, many. I know there are some local authorities on this call. Be aware that there have been various sort of rounds of funding available that sort of central government makes available, and sort of bid-based funding. This in the past has been quite focused on charge point infrastructure itself, so quite narrow in focus. And most recently, I think with the Levi Fund, there's a recognition of the need to also develop skills and strategies to enable the transition as well. So funding's not only been available for providing the infrastructure, but also for developing some of the strategies and some of the skills and jobs and posts that are also needed, because EVs are kind of a new area, even in the UK, and not every local authority is sort of set up to really implement EV networks at scale and has the resources to do so. So I expect this is a trend that's going to continue, and yeah, that's probably it from me. Talia, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yeah, well, so I can't say too much about UK, despite us being based in London. We are focusing, after all, on Eastern Europe and Caucasus, Central Asia, North Africa, Middle East. But with that said, I mean, our flagship program is Green Cities. We focus on local authorities there. And so absolutely, that's really who we engage with often. On the UK side, what we can say, because we're based here and the UK has a lot of progress in the area, we try to tap into UK know-how. So I will say that. So often we have local authorities come on study trips, and it won't be just a TfL or London, but it'll be to smaller municipalities or towns to kind of share best practices, and always, I would say, with an eye towards implementation versus, let's say, technology choice. Thank you.
Thanks both for your answers on that. The next question is open to all panel members, and it is starts with a statement. I think you will get a widespread adoption of electric vehicles only after a comprehensive nationwide charging infrastructure is in place. Do you agree? Would anyone like to come in on that one first?
I don't mind taking that one, Georgia. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what your sort of ambition is for that adoption. I think what we're seeing, particularly in the UK, is actually really most people will charge. If we're talking about private cars, they'll charge them at home. So if that accounts for 80-90% of their charging needs, then having that sort of public infrastructure is less of a barrier to adoption from that perspective. But then there's also lots of people who are traveling longer distances, who are going away from home, who the range of their trips is going to be longer than their battery might last. And you also have to think that batteries also degrade over time and become less the duration that you can travel, the sort of out of the box range that your car manufacturer might quote you will reduce as well. So there's lots of, and it comes back to this range anxiety and confidence question, and providing people with certainty. So yes, a national network in any shape or form for any country is really important to facilitate, to maximizing adoption. But I think the home charging piece is probably the most, or has been the most important thing to get right initially, and then the absence of a national charging network really becomes more of a constraint, particularly when we talk about the ambition of targets and net zero and everything, and from that side as well. It's really important that we do all get that one right.
Maybe I'll jump in and just echo. I think it's a good question, and I think in a perfect world, that's definitely what we'd want. But as Tom's saying, I think some of the first natural uptakers are those who are home charging, because it's simply easier, more accessible. We're also looking at fleet owners, again, because they have high usage, so shorter payback periods. And I think what we see is probably that's how we end up getting towards that 5% I was mentioning about market penetration. And then you have the kind of learning effects, the laws are in place, charge point operators start to come into place. I think that's why it's so important that we look at it as an ecosystem. All of this is helping each other in another way. I saw some research just published this week saying that for leading EV markets, it took 6 years to go from 1% to 10%, and then another 6 years to go from 10% to 80%. That's not necessarily the curve everyone will follow per se, but I think it says a lot about the difficulties, certainly in the beginning, and then it takes off. But you have to take into account different kind of country conditions. I remember seeing an old survey in the States showing that I think it was 12% of Americans drive over 100 kilometers per day, but 50% think they do. And that's important because when you're planning charging infrastructure, you actually have to think about the 50%. In other words, you have to think about where people think they need to go also, which is, a very hard thing to model. And I think that brings the importance of today's discussion to point, I hope. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We are almost at the end of this webinar. I think we have room for one or two more questions, and I want to get Richard's view. I think this is a question that our UK local authority will want to know from you, learn from the Dutch your experience in the province. Is your funding stream for charging infrastructure rollout steady and stable?
Yeah, it is in fact related to my previous answer. As I said, the government, local government, national government do not pay directly for the realization of the infrastructure. Of course, there's people supporting the municipalities and the provinces to have it all going. But there's no funding for the charges itself, if that's meant, because the construction is such that the commercial parties, the CPOs, are the ones that do the investment, and as I said, earn the money, but also take the risk.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Okay, sure. No, that's fine. And this is probably our last question. This is about Volt. What relationship do you have with the DNOs in the UK? Does your algorithm include grid capacity constraint? So it's a question for Tom. Does Volt include grid capacity, grid information in the algorithm?
So the key piece of electrical information in Volt is really the low voltage power network. So having that data from the DNOs is crucial. That sort of tells you where your connectors are and how you minimize the cost of kind of connecting charge points up to the network. In terms of the capacity, we do know that's a constraint in many areas. If that data exists, we can plug it into Volt, and Volt, as I say, is highly customizable. It really depends on what each client would want Volt to do and deliver for it. So I don't think it's in there at the moment, but it could be. Is probably the answer to that question.
Yeah, I can add a little answer to this one, because my experience is that information is not available in a map or so, or in a layer that you can import in your Volt system. So what we use is indeed the low voltage network, sometimes with mistakes, which is very frustrating, because then you think you have found the right spot, and then during realization you find out it's a lot further away from the network because that cable was not. So talking about experiences, make sure that you have the best grid information available in your tooling. Otherwise, as I said, you'll run into issues later on. But information about capacity, very, very relevant subject in the Netherlands at the moment, probably everywhere, but at least in Holland, it's a big issue. Not so much on the low voltage, on the slightly higher level, the medium and the high voltage. But that information is not so easy to import and take into account, because it always has it requires discussion with the network operator for a specific location, because there's all kinds of dependencies involved.
Hey, thank you both. We are going to bring the Q&A discussion to a close now, and thank you all for your fantastic questions that you've shared with us. Unfortunately, there were so many that we've not quite managed to get through them all today. For anybody who is still waiting for an answer to their question, who didn't hear an answer today, if you wanted to follow up with us via email, we will try and get those answers over to you from the most relevant panelist. And as we bring this webinar to a close today, I just want to say thank you for attending the webinar. I hope you found the session very useful, and I'm sure that you will join me in saying a big thank you to all of our fantastic speakers as well for their presentations today. And the recording of the session will be shared with you, as I mentioned at the start. So thank you once again, and we hope to see you on another webinar soon. Thanks.